Now, I very rarely make videos related to the troubles in Northern Ireland. I made a few years ago, partly to do with my identity. Um, Firstly, I want to explain why I've disabled comments on this video. On those videos that I made about my Northern Irish identity, unfortunately, despite my best efforts, it attracted sectarian comments, and that's something I just don't want to give a platform to. What I mean by sectarian comments is finger pointing at one side or the other, and just the sort of bullshit that I think Northern Ireland really has enough of. Now, of course, this video is going to be opinionated, and I'm going to have strong views on certain subjects. But what this video is not is sectarian, insofar as Catholic versus Protestant, and not even particularly nationalist versus unionist. Nationalist in this context, somewhat different from Scottish nationalism. Um, I just want to speak about a group and my thoughts on them. A bit of background to people outside the United Kingdom and Ireland, i.e., outside the British Isles. This is a very, very complex conflict, and I don't really have time in the video to go into all the details. Partly because I'm not an academic. I'm not going to claim to have researched the subject exhaustively, and even if I had, it's not something that could really be done in a 10-minute video. So I'm not going to attempt to do that. But suffice to say, the reasons for the conflict are long and complex. Some people will try to present it as black and white. It's not actually. Um, Another point I'd like to make, and this particularly is a message to those outside this part of the world. A lot of the time, especially in cinema, the Irish Republican cause has been romanticized. Um, and there's no question about it, it's a very pivotal part of Irish history. But it should never, ever, ever be forgotten or whitewashed, sidelined, or overlooked the fact that the Irish Republican Army, and that's not the group I'm going to particularly talk about in this video, but I just want to touch on this point, murdered scores of civilians in their campaign. This is absolutely irrefutable. I'm talking about the modern conflict from 1968 onwards. Um, that largely ended in 1998, but it can't really be called over. Largely ended insofar as the main violence was more or less over. Um, it should never be forgotten that the IRA had the blood of hundreds, thousands, including the wounded thousands of civilians on their hands. To cite a few examples, 21 people murdered in Birmingham in a pub. These weren't soldiers, these weren't powerful politicians. Not that that would be a justification, but these were just civilians enjoying a night out. In Northern Ireland itself, there's countless massacres attributed to the IRA. Um, and I do feel that sometimes these atrocities get overlooked when other atrocities, like Bloody Sunday, are repeatedly cited. And I think that sometimes I see on the internet people who clearly don't know what the hell they're talking about. Quite often, these are people with some sort of anti British bias. Sometimes they're Russians. That's to do with the current tensions between the West and Russia, and they come out with a lot of crap. Very occasionally Chinese, but not very much. But very often these are people who really, really don't know the situation, and they just come out with blanket statements that give Ireland back to the Irish. Um, I've got very little patience for such people, but I've even less of patience with people who are in this part of the world and who are in a position to know the deed. I'm not even talking about people who are biased insofar as they're Irish Republicans. I'm talking about people in Britain who come out with that sort of crap. I expect Irish Republicans to say that. That's what they believe. That's their motivation. That is their agenda. But when I see certain people in the UK come out with that statement, I think it's utterly reprehensible. As for Jeremy Corbyn, I think his attitude to the IRA is a disgrace. And people can't say it's neutral. It's not. Because he was given an opportunity 5 times to condemn the actions of the IRA, and he didn't. Now, people will say that's because we're at a time when we're moving on. But, he didn't give that attitude when he was condemning the British in the same interview. He said, oh, but let's not forget all the things the British done. So, in other words, he's making this insinuation that it's a generic condemnation of violence, and yet he's specifically naming the British, whilst point blank refusing to condemn the atrocities committed by the IRA. Now, things have changed. Former, warlords, if that is the right word, and I'm not sure, that gives a sort of image of Afghan-style warlords. Obviously, Northern Ireland's a much, much smaller scale than some other conflicts in the world, but has to remember this is a small place, and over 3,500 people lost their lives in this conflict. Granted, it was over a long period of time, but it's fair to say that Northern Ireland saw more political violence than anywhere else in Western Europe in the second half of the 20th century. It far surpasses anything seen in Corsica or the Basque Country. This is where I grew up. So, and I came from a liberal background. I was very fortunate in not growing up in a sort of area that was deeply entrenched in the Troubles. I wouldn't say I was shielded from it completely because I did see some things that were unpleasant, but I can't say that I was really, traumatized by it or something. That wouldn't be true because I wasn't. But since coming to England, it has had a big impact on me knowing where I come from and the situation there. Anyway, one of the things I notice is that very often, especially when Hollywood presents this conflict, I'll give an example of this. The film The Devil's Own with Brad Pitt. Now, in one way, I like that film. It's a soundtrack that is very moving and good acting from Harrison Ford and Pitt. It it's a watchable film. There's no denying it. But there's also no denying that it kind of edges you towards sympathy to Brad Pitt's character, when essentially all he is a murdering terrorist. Now, the opening of the film shows that his father is brutally murdered by presumably loyalist terrorists, and there were loyalist terrorists, of course there were. But it's kind of like trying to make a moral argument to justify what he's doing. And I guess the storyline is that this is what happens in Northern Ireland. But I couldn't help thinking there was a sympathetic edge to him in that film. And there's other examples. The Crying Game. I haven't seen 1971. I was sort of going to see it, but then I changed my mind. I guess I would have found it too depressing. Most of the films made from about the Troubles are from the Republican perspective. There isn't that many films. I can't think of any off the top of my head from the Unionist side. And it would be good if there was one just to balance things out. Unfortunately, the Unionist side is very often, and I'll explain why I'm saying unfortunately in a minute. The Unionist side is often tarred as sort of like the far right, and it's kind of associated with bigotry and kind of Paisley-esque hate. Um, and there's no question about it. There is very much that faction on the Unionist side. Northern Ireland, I hate to say it, is one of the most racist parts of the United Kingdom. There's definitely a far right ideology within Unionist thinking. Not just far right against outsiders, but there has always been a superior attitude, and this was one of the reasons the Troubles began. But whilst taking that into account, it's also indisputable that the real IRA murdered scores of civilians. So when people come out with things like free the Irish and these sort of blanket statements, and they talk about Bloody Sunday, and by the way, I'm under no illusions that was an atrocity. But let's put things in context. 13 people were killed in that day. Where is the tears and the inquiries for the 18 killed at Ballykelly? And there's countless other examples. Warren Point, Warrington, Manchester. No one died in Manchester, but hundreds were injured. Countless attacks in London. The 6 people murdered at Harrods. The list goes on and on and on. Um, and I've always been very careful when I'm speaking about the Troubles because I don't want to be sort of painted as a unionist insofar as, oh, this guy is going to make excuses for the UVF and the UDA and all the rest of it. No, I have no interest in doing that. I want nothing to do with those people. But I am a regular British citizen who gets a bit tired of the romanticisation of Irish Republican terror. And that is what it is. If you deliberately target civilian areas, as far as I'm concerned, you're a terrorist. Is there state terrorism? Yes, there is. Anyway, I want to get to the main point, which is what I was talking about earlier, and I want to broaden this out a bit. But the reason I was talking about that is because it's something I think needs to be said. We have moved on. The IRA has disbanded now. They're now involved in politics. They realized that bombs and bullets were not going to get them what they want. Now, there's a group called the Real IRA. This group may only have 200 to 300 members. On MI5, they're actually considered as big a risk in Northern Ireland as ISIS is to the rest of the country. I've read a report from the Belfast Telegraph, which is, if accurate, is quite disturbing. And this is according to the Israeli security forces. Well, it's from Forbes Israel. I imagine they've got that from Mossad or whatever. Say what you want about Israel, but their intelligence is pretty top notch. Um, they put the following 10 terror groups as the wealthiest in the world. ISIS is not surprisingly at number one, 1.3 billion, followed by Hamas, followed by the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, followed by Hezbollah, followed by the Taliban, followed by Al Qaeda and its affiliates, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Al-Shabaab. The real IRA is at number 9, then Boko Haram. So the real IRA, with an estimated chest of 32 million, ranks between Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram. That's pretty serious for a group that has an estimated 300 members. That can only mean there are more members, or this group is very, very good at organizing itself. No doubt they're getting that money from sorts of sources. I personally think they're the scum of the earth because, just to be clear, these people are absolutely hell-bent on continuing their campaign through violence. There's no question about it. They've already killed several people. Police officers who are from the newly created Northern Ireland Police Service, not the Royal Ulster Constabulary, Northern Ireland Police Service. I believe they killed 2 young officers about 6 years ago. And this is a very dangerous group. Small, but dangerous. Um, the truth is, the vast majority of people on the island of Ireland want peace. Doesn't mean everyone agrees. Of course, a lot of people in Ireland want a united Ireland. And of course, the Irish government ultimately wants a united Ireland. But they realise that to behave as a nation state, they cannot endorse a terrorist organisation. In fact, they realise that this group is just as much a threat to the Republic of Ireland. Because they see that these people are cranks. They see the rest of, they see the Garda and so on as traitors. Because as far as they're concerned, this is a war. So they actually want a war between the nation states of Ireland and the United Kingdom. Now, the fact of the matter is, Ireland and the United Kingdom have very good relations. Do they agree on the issue of a united Ireland? Of course not. That's always been an issue of contention. But they realised a long time ago they could not endorse these terrorist organisations because Ireland is a small but proud country. I have enormous respect for the Republic of Ireland. I like the Republic of Ireland. Thought this on a physics to Dublin a few years back, you know? And I really, really want good relations between the United Kingdom and Ireland. We're neighbouring countries. We have good trade. We have similar culture. There's a lot of areas where we can find common ground on. And if it is the case that Northern Ireland eventually goes back into a united Ireland, if it is done by the ballot, that's the course of history. But organisations like the real IRA need to understand that they will never, ever, ever win. The main IRA understood that because after years of bloody mayhem, they realised their little campaign wasn't going to work anymore. They're now taking part in the political process. And, Stormont has its share of arguments. Stormont, like any parliament, has strong arguments. And things haven't exactly been comfy recently. But I don't think the main IRA will ever go back to their campaign of violence. Now, in case anyone's going to say, oh, well, you're British, you're biased, and so on and so on, I don't need to repeat myself. The British, the Unionist side, was far from innocent. There were atrocities committed on both sides. This was a brutal, low-level war. And for those on the front line, it certainly wasn't low-level. Like I say, I personally was fortunate. But there were people really in the midst of this, and for them it must have really felt like a real war. But the reason I'm making this video is partly to talk about that issue of presenting the IRA as some sort of freedom fighters. They weren't. Let's just be clear about that. What freedom did they give to the young boy killed in Warrington? Where was, what sort of moral vindication can you possibly place on a group that targeted civilian targets? The real IRA, incidentally, I mentioned they killed an officer. Actually, they were culpable for the Omagh bombing. This was an atrocity to the international viewers that murdered 29 civilians in a small town in Northern Ireland, injured scores more. So there's absolutely no moral high ground that this sick bunch of extremists can possibly have. The only difference really between them and ISIS is they're smaller, and as far as I know, they're not religious nuts. But they are violent thugs who want Ireland's problems, north and south, to continue with bullets and bombs. And it's never going to work. Now, if you're watching this video and you're an Irish Republican, obviously you're going to be disagreeing with unionism, and you're going to be disagreeing with a lot of my views. But I would hope that you would be open-minded enough to agree that violence is not going to get them their way. Let's be clear, there's no British troops in Ireland, north or south. And that's something international viewers need to be aware of. As for, when outside sources like Russia Today try to make this, try to fit this into their own agenda, think of how that contrasts with Russia. Russia has troops in Chechnya. It's absolute rank hypocrisy. I mean, do you think the Russian security forces have a peaceful record in Chechnya? I cannot stand the hypocrisy of nations like Russia pointing the finger at the United Kingdom through their state media and, talk about the imperialist Brits doing this and that. Russia, keeps control of its republics with an iron fist. It's total hypocrisy. Northern Ireland, by contrast, has its own parliament, has its own police service, is a devolved power, and if the situation ultimately arises that there is an environment for a referendum, I'd imagine that would go ahead. I actually believe it will happen in my lifetime. Now, I consider myself British. I believe Northern Ireland should be part of the United Kingdom, but I'm also a Democrat. And if there was a situation where there's an overwhelming and clear majority of Northern Ireland want to be in the Republic, I couldn't realistically oppose that. And the truth is, I think it may be inevitable in my lifetime. But history has to record that there was no moral vindication from getting that from bullets and bombs. And history will record that it was politics and negotiation and voting that got a united Ireland, not bullets and bombs. Let's stop pretending that these fucking terrorists are heroes, because they're not. All they are is, in fact, you know what? Terrorists almost gives them a sort of caliber of respect, like they're political martyrs. When the reality is, they're basically just criminals. And the truth is, both governments realize that. The IRA realizes that. The Unionists realize that. Pretty much 95% of the people on the island of Ireland realize that. And these morons represent no one but themselves. Now, to balance things out, are there some on the Unionist side that aren't helping matters? Yeah, I'm sure there are. And you know, the Unionist side has plenty of its thugs of its own. But I want the rest of the world to know that this is not a black and white situation. And thousands of British and Northern Irish, and Irish for that matter, civilians have suffered in this conflict. And the vast majority of people don't want this anymore. The British government doesn't want it. The Irish government doesn't want it. The devolved government in Northern Ireland doesn't want it. And I just hope the police services in Northern Ireland are given the support by both sides. Because it would be an utter shameful disgrace if the IRA, or I should say the former IRA leadership, doesn't put their full weight behind supporting the security services, which are neutral. This is a newly designated force in Northern Ireland, which is neutral. It's not a Royal Ulster Constabulary anymore, it's Northern Ireland Police Service. And whatever issues elected politicians have with how that is run, they should be doing their job and backing this force to do their job and arrest these terrorists. And frankly, I hope they're not killed, because if they are, all it will do is martyrize them. I want to see them arrested and jailed for terrorism. Just in case anyone thinks, oh, well, they're only targeting soldiers and police. Not that that would be justified anyway, but, you know, actually, they're a terrorist organisation. They placed a bomb on the Dublin to Belfast to Dublin railway line, which inevitably endangered civilian lives. They murdered 29 people in Omagh. Given half a chance, these guys would commit mass murder. It's a testament, I think, to the Northern Ireland Police Service that they have managed to um, keep the security that they have. I'll leave it there.